at war with Torah. Having spent some time on origins, we came to some conclusions. We're made in the image of God, not the image of beasts. Our hearts were made in and for paradise, not some evolutionary struggle. We cannot improve on paradise. When we try to do that, that's called sin. We only break things. Human history is one of regressive devolution. We're going downhill fast. And how we differ from paradise equals our brokenness, not our progress. We believe that marriage is what the Bible calls one flesh. Governments can do one property. Humans can do one body. Only God can do one flesh. He split the one atom into two. That was a miracle. He brought the two back into one. That's just as big of a miracle. And still is. One flesh is the only safe place for one body, lest the one be broken apart into two broken persons. We need to have God set the one flesh glue before we do the one body thing so that we don't fall back apart and end up breaking each other. Torah stories. We're watching social roles and moral rules fleshed out in the real lives. And you've noticed we've I think, made more sense out of sexually moral issues. I mean, we've dealt with incest and what I'd call reverse incest. We've dealt with polygamy. We've dealt with slavery. We've dealt with a lot of the hot topics, and they start making more sense when we actually look at the laws in light of stories rather than just trying to look at legal detail. We're approaching it all from a regressive devolutionary worldview, which means we're looking back with respect on the past, not they were cavemen that we've progressed way beyond. We may have progressed technologically, but we have regressed morally, spiritually, socially. God's laws are simply intrinsic reality. God didn't make them up. He's simply describing how life works. When you read the laws of physics, they're not laws that somebody made up. They're laws that were devolved. What's the word I'm looking for? Derived. Thank you very much. That was it. Laws that are derived from observing what is. God observes what is as he made it, realizes we're in a very myopic position and we can only see the four walls around us and there's so much more out there. So he tells us this is how life works. And from our perspective, sometimes that doesn't make sense. That doesn't seem to make sense. Do we trust him? Do we trust God with life and love here and now? Do we think we'll find the fullest life living out his ways, or do we think we'll find the fullest life living out our natural broken selves? Now, last evening we talked about divorce. We noted that the marriage of Abraham to Hagar has all the right words and phrases for the formula of a marriage in the Hebrew language in the Old Testament. This is not just somebody he spent a night with to have a kid. She became his wife. Then we noted that when the two heirs, Ishmael about 16 and Isaac now, little laughter was his name, was about 2 at the weaning party, Ishmael is poking fun at Isaac. And Sarah says, no, we're not having that older son of the servant woman rivaling for my son being the heir. Cast her out. Abraham is grieved. God says, listen to the voice of your wife. You listened when she said, take Hagar. You're going to have to listen now. So God says to Abraham, go ahead and cast her out. And so Abraham was grieved. That's his son, his firstborn heir. Abraham sleeps on it. The next morning, according to God's direction, he provisions her and the lad and sends them away. And the word for cast out and the word for send away are the two key words in the Old Testament used in every verse save one that deals with divorce. A divorced woman is a cast out woman. To divorce a woman is to send her away. So I believe you have the first story of a polygamous marriage. We know that Lamech had one before, and it looks like there are others who must have. We have the first story, and in the process of that, we have the first divorce. And the first divorce didn't happen on the evil side, it happened on the good side. And what can bother us sometimes is it seems that God said to Abraham, go ahead and divorce her. Right? Listen to the voice of your wife and send her away. Does God ever approve of divorce? Does God ever have to do what he doesn't approve of? The whole sin problem involves plan B, right? God may be sovereign, but because he sovereignly gave us free will, he doesn't always get his way. The amazing thing about God's sovereignty is through all the ups and downs and arounds and corruption and junk we get into because of free will, God is sovereignly able to somehow, without violating our free will, eventually bring it all back together if we'll trust him. That's the amazing thing. That's the amazing thing. What were the grounds for this divorce? Jesus says only sexual unfaithfulness. Well, there was none of that. There was marital strife between two wives. There was potential strife between two heirs. That's not a proper biblical basis for divorce. What do you do with these cognitive dissonances sometimes we get when God doesn't follow his own rules? Or seems not to? This is a special circumstance. God had called Abraham to develop this missionary nation that's going to bless the whole world with the truth about who God is and how his way of life is better. After 10 years, they got antsy, did it man's way, came up with an heir. Abraham says to God about a dozen years later, when God's talking to him again about this, he says, oh, that Ishmael would stand before you. No, God says, it's going to be between you and Sarah. It's going to be from your two bodies. And Abraham laughed. And when Sarah heard about it a while later, she laughed. So God named the little child Laughter. But this is a situation where God, who hates divorce, remember that verse? Remember the Old Testament? Divorce is tolerated, conceded, permitted, even assumed, but never commanded, commended, or approved. We looked at all the verses last night. There's no divine legislation on the right way to get a divorce. There's only a few rules relating to when it happens. Then you do this or that or the other thing when it happens. But God, who hates divorce, he hates sending away, said to Abraham, you've complicated things over this heir and the creating of the missionary nation. You have to send him away. Trust me with him. I'll take care of him and make him a great nation over here because he's your heir. But we're going to go on with the original plan with the heir that I gave you through you and Sarah. How do we deal with that? That's not according to the rules. If we're too rule-oriented, we're in trouble here. God is okaying a divorce without proper grounds. God is okaying divorce on the grounds that the children aren't getting along. Since when has that been grounds for divorce? Is God inconsistent? Do we use this to license our own divorces? I'd say neither. You know, there's a concept in British common law called the idea of equity. It's a legal philosophy. And the idea is that behind every human law, this came from the 1600s, okay? That behind every human law is a higher transcendent principle that the human law or constitution at best imperfectly reflects. So every human law is an imperfect reflection of some greater thing that actually came from God. No law can foresee every circumstance to which it may someday need to be applied. Cases in which applying the letter will contradict the spirit. A very imperfect example, but when I was about 2 years old, I walked into the kitchen. I was the right height to walk right under the table, right? I just keep right on going. And Mom was chopping some walnuts. I reached up, grabbed walnuts, stuffed them in my mouth, and took a deep breath. And immediately completely choked myself. And they had me upside down, beaten on my back. And Mom's beaten on my back upside down while Dad's, with his horn blowing, going through the red lights in downtown Saginaw, Michigan, to the hospital. The police tries to pull him over. They see what's going on. The police goes around, and they all break the law all the way to the hospital. The idea of equity, there was a time when the law that's designed to protect everybody had to be broken to protect. Okay? Maybe that's a way we can look at the fact that even God, who made rules on when was the only time you could get a divorce, knows that any stated principle cannot necessarily fit every circumstance. And so he said, you got to let Ishmael go in order to get back to the plan that you messed up with your impatience. That higher principle behind every fallible human law, concept that's, by the way, largely lost in current evolutionary thinking. Because in current evolutionary thinking, there's no greater law behind the laws we've made. Therefore, you find law losing equity becoming absolute and being applied in some of the most ridiculous ways. So the guilty go free technically on a technicality while the innocent suffer unjustly. By the way, if you decide to use this story of Hagar as grounds for you to dump your wife or husband, you're not thinking. You're not listening. All right, let's go to the next story. Chapter 22 of Genesis. Turn there. In chapter 22, God does something that stretches our brain with cognitive dissonance again. It came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said, Abraham, and he said, here I am. So notice Abraham recognized the voice. It's very important. He recognized and acknowledged that he knew it was the voice of God that he had heard before. Once that was recognized, God said, now take your son, your only. Well, he's the only one left because God sent the other one away. I think the only here plays in a little bit to Jesus being the only begotten son. The heir of promise, the one through whom the promise will be fulfilled. Take your only son, whom you love. It's almost like God's stacking the deck here. Take your son, your only son whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you. This is almost as if God is restarting Abraham on his journey, because remember on his journey in the beginning, God said, go, and I'll tell you when you got there. You know, there will be a little arrow over the place pointing down. This is the place. Now, go, and when you get there, I'll tell you you're there. Just go. Go towards the mountains of Moriah. I'll tell you when you're there. It's almost like the journey all over again. So Abram rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men. The word for young men is na'ar. Na'ar seems in almost every case, and there are several hundred of them in the Old Testament, to refer to young men of responsible age. The kind you would arm for war, the kinds you would send on an errand. Post-puberty young men who are able to take responsibility, with only 2 exceptions. It's used to refer to baby Moses in the basket, who clearly was not that case, and to little Samuel before he was weaned. But in every other case in the Bible, it's a young man of responsible age. Took with him 2 young men, and Isaac his son. He split wood for the burnt offering, arose and went to the place which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. You know, God must have put an arrow down, that's the place. However it was. And Abraham said to his young men, so at least 2 attendants along, 2 na'arim would be the plural. Stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Now, I do not understand translators, because the word lad there is na'ar. So why doesn't it say, he said to the lads, stay here and I'll take the lad with me? Because it's the same word. The point I'm trying to make here is by all uses of this word, except for those two odd uses, Isaac is a young man of responsible age. He's not a baby. He's not a 6-year-old. He's able to carry the wood. His dad, well, let's see. Sarah died at 127, so Sarah died when Isaac was 37. This happened sometime between the weaning, 2 and 37, okay? We don't know where. But it appears it wasn't when he was 3 or 4. He's a young man. He's able to carry the wood, having conversation with Dad. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac, his son, and took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, yes, here I am, my son. He said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. There's a lot of theology in that, but we don't have time for that tonight. And the two of them went on together, and they came to the place which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now, I believe one thing is clear. Isaac was old enough to knock the old man down and get off the mountain alive. Which means Isaac agreed. He trusted his father enough to believe that his father said, God told me to kill you. Okay. I know you know the voice of God. There are two things that God absolutely hates. He hates divorce and he hates human sacrifice. And now we have him sanctioning a divorce and giving directions to sacrifice a boy. You do not sacrifice and have the animal live. It's death. Now, of course, we can read the story. We can read Paul. You know, we will go and sacrifice and we will come back. Because God had said, it's not Ishmael, it's Isaac. You will become a great nation through Isaac. So now Abraham has cognitive dissonance. God said, Isaac's going to live long enough to have offspring. He's just told me to kill him. If you're looking for rules, you're going to be in trouble. Right? Abraham's going by the voice of God. Now, there was no Bible yet. How do we have a relationship with God? We read our Bible, and we pray, and we have a relationship with God, right? Could you have a relationship with God if you had no Bible? Everybody who had a relationship with God did it without a Bible up until Moses wrote the first books. How did Enoch walk with God when he didn't have the Word of God? Now, well, let's read some verses. Leviticus 18:21, you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am Yehovah. No child sacrifice. Torah. Whoever of the children of Israel or of a stranger or the sojourner, that means anybody inside the country, doesn't matter what your religion is, anybody who gives any of his descendants to Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I will set my face against that man and cut him off from his people, because he has given some of his descendants to Molech to defile my sanctuary, to profane my holy name. If the people of the land should in any way hide their eyes from that man and do not kill him, then I'll set my face against that man and against his family, and I'll cut him off from his people, all who prostitute themselves to commit harlotry with Molech. Wow. God says, you kill him or I'll kill him. offer your child to the false god, child sacrifice, you're dead. Abraham, go sacrifice your son. What do we do with this? Deuteronomy 12:29. When the Lord your God cuts off from before you the nations that you go in to dispossess, and you displace them and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you do not be ensnared, that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed from before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? I will do likewise. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abomination to the Lord which he hates they have done to their gods, for they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to their God. Final verse in Torah on this: when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of these nations. By the way, this word abomination here is to'ibah. It's the big sledgehammer abomination word. Of all the abomination, detestable, whatever words, and there are several of them, this is the big one. This is the big hammer. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or sorcerers, or conjures spells, or medium, a spiritus, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. Because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. God makes it pretty clear he does not want us sacrificing our children as part of worship. And yet he says to Abraham, go sacrifice your son. A little bit of cognitive dissonance here. Counterintuitive commands of God.
Fire, though, would that make the difference? They all said fire.
On an altar, it's going to, with the wood.
But they're dead first. I don't know.
Hang with me. Let's talk about the sacrifices for a minute. The sacrifices in the Bible to God, he always defined what we were to bring as a sacrifice, correct? What were we to bring? A clean animal from the flock, sheep or goat. Now I know there were the turtle doves, but generally it was a clean animal, generally from the flock. The sacrifices were not about what we bring to God, but our understanding and acceptance of what God brings to us. I get this out of, there are about 2 or 3 key sacrificial stories in the Old Testament. The first one is God made tunics of skin. He clothed their nakedness through the death of an animal. Adam and Eve had been told, sin and you will go to a high, death means, to die means, you'll surely die. It means to go to a higher state of living and be more like God. That's what die means. They'd never seen die. How do you tell a 2-year-old die? What does it mean? You know, we buried Grandpa last Wednesday evening at my church of some little children. They were trying to figure out where Grandpa was, right? You know, the parakeet's upside down and the legs up in the cage, and you have to explain to the 3-year-old what happened. This is one of the tough points in life. Adam and Eve, very smart, but they had no idea what die meant. They only knew life. So what does God do? Calls over a little animal, probably a lamb or a goat. Kills it. Blood, guts, rips the skin off. What a mess. Makes clothes and puts on. They feel so much better, but they already lost their lunch in the bush for, you know. That's die. It's not an up, it's a down. That's die. And then, next story, Cain and Abel bring their sacrifices. They both bring the best that they have. What more can God ask for than the best that we can bring? But God did not respect Abel's offering of the best fruit of his garden. I'm sorry, Cain's offering because of the best fruit of his garden. He only respected Abel's offering of the lamb. Why? It's not about what you bring to God. Bringing a sacrifice isn't bringing a gift to God to somehow make him feel better about you. The sacrifice is about you bringing something that shows you understand and accept what God is bringing to you.